in the South. And we will hear from 3 incredible leaders. And I'm going to do the same thing where I sort of introduce them really briefly at the beginning so that I won't come back up and speak again until the end. So speaking about, or titled, their talk is titled, Exploring Louisiana's Internment History, Camp Livingston in World War II, are Hayley Johnson and Sarah Sims. Hayley is the head of open scholarship and government publications at the Louisiana State University Library. And Sarah Sims is the undergraduate and student success librarian at Louisiana State University as well. And back in 2016, Hayley and Sarah began researching the Nisei who were incarcerated in Louisiana during World War II. So they're going to share a bit about their research and their work, and we're so delighted to have them here. And then next we will hear about Nisei and Nisei soldiers during and after World War II from Stuart Hirai. Stu is a sansei raised on an irrigated farm in Eastern Oregon, where his family moved in June of 1942 as a result of Executive Order 9066. Stu has been researching and studying the Nisei soldiers for many years and has also led small group tours to the battle sites in Italy and France where the 100th and 442 fought. So thank you, the 3 of you, for being here. We're going to hear from each of them, and then we will have time for questions. So please, write down, think about any questions you have. We'll have microphones to run out to the audience, and we'll also have questions from our live stream audience as well. So thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Hayley and Sarah.
Hi, y'all. How is everyone doing? Good lunch? Did y'all have a good lunch? Yes. So Hayley and I are going to share the podium. We do everything together. So we're going to be trying this. We'll try. So we are excited to be here with you today and share a bit about our research into Camp Livingston. Specifically how Camp Livingston is different from the WRA camps like Jerome and Rower, and how we were able to conduct this research into a site that no longer exists and has no real existing memory within the state of Louisiana. Please forgive us if we read from our notes. We could talk about this for hours, and we just want to make sure that we don't impede on any time that we might have with Stu. So again, forgive us if we read from notes.
So Sarah and I have been researching Camp Livingston since late 2016, so 7 years of work so far, and our interest in Camp Livingston really did start by chance. On the slide is a picture of this article that I saw in May of 2016 that was posted on the LA Times website. And I was moved by the videos of Muslim children reading aloud letters written some 74 years prior by Japanese American children were written in camp, and they were reading these alongside actual incarceration camp survivors. So this article sparked a curiosity with me about Louisiana's involvement in internment or incarceration during World War II. I thought I had remembered hearing about Japanese being held in the state, but I thought it was POWs and not civilian men who were being held in the camps. So from this article, we had this general curiosity, and we started reaching out to places where we thought the information might be housed. So as librarians, we figured that the easiest way to find out about Camp Livingston would be to reach out to those local historical institutions around Alexandria, Louisiana, who may have the resources and the history compiled already. So in 2016, we reached out first to the curator at the Louisiana History Museum in Alexandria for any information that they may have. The museum curator, however, had no knowledge or items related to an internment camp, so we hit our first research wall. The curator, however, was able to give us a name of a local Japanese family who lived in Louisiana, so we did have at least one lead to follow. Next, we visited the archives housed at the Louisiana State University Alexandria campus. There we found a few camp completion reports about Livingston generally, but not a critical volume 4, which was supposed to detail the building of an enemy alien internment camp. So that was our second wall. And then we hit our third wall when we reached out to the Louisiana Maneuvers and Military Museum that's right outside of Alexandria. The museum is located in Camp Beauregard, and it pays tribute to the famous Louisiana maneuvers, which actually took place at Camp Livingston. The museum's curator was also unaware of an enemy alien internment camp and anything that took place there. So we really were expecting one of those 3 institutions to have some sort of information on the internment camp, since it was such a major component of Camp Livingston's history. But no one had anything, and no one even realized that the men held in Livingston were not actually POWs, but rather were alien citizens taken from their homes and interned starting on December 7th.
So when we first started researching Camp Livingston, we were completely unaware that a program existed outside of the WRA camps created to detain alien residents. So now, when we speak on this, we spend time making the distinction between WRA family camps and the internment of enemy aliens at Department of Justice and Army camps to almost everyone we encounter during our research process. We feel that it's important to take just a few moments to discuss the classification of enemy aliens so that everyone understands that individuals in this category were different from those WRA incarcerees. Individuals became classified as enemy aliens when the United States declared war with the Axis nations after Pearl Harbor. The custodial detention list, also known as the ABC classification matrix, was used to evaluate the dangerousness of organizations and individuals and pre-designate those who would later be interned when the United States went to war against the Axis forces. So these lists were compiled from years of surveillance, and this was done, it was conducted by various agencies like the Office of Naval Intelligence. The ABC lists were a matrix where aliens were classified into different groups. So Group A would be considered most dangerous and should be interned. Group B, somewhat dangerous, and their activities should be restricted. And Group C, least dangerous, not restricted, just generally surveilled. The Enemy Alien Internment Program is a separate and lesser known program whereby individuals of Japanese, German, and Italian ancestry were interned beginning December 7th, 1941, until after the conclusion of the war. The authority for the internment was the Alien Enemies Act of 1798. The majority of the men rounded up as enemy aliens in the hours after Pearl Harbor and beyond were male immigrant community leaders who held positions of power or influence. They were typically community and business leaders who served in positions such as Japanese language teachers, newspaper editors, Buddhist priests, or heads of Japanese associations. These men were Nisei. They were barred by federal law from becoming naturalized American citizens, even though, as we know, the majority had lived in the United States for several decades, had raised their children here, and their children were US citizens, and had no plans to return to Japan. The men detained were sent to enemy alien internment camps after cursory hearings before boards. In many cases, they were separated from their families for years. These all-male camps were run by the Department of Justice or the United States Army and were in a different system than the 10 larger WRA concentration camps that held both Issei and Nisei. If an enemy alien was cleared by the board on his hearing, he was not released. He was transferred into the WRA camp system and could possibly be reunited with his family. On the left side of this slide, you can see the notice that was posted to aliens of enemy nationalities by the US Department of Justice, requiring them to apply for certificates of identification at their local post office. And on the right, this is just an image from an FBI file where we can see that the individual has been designated as Group A.
So many of you would have probably seen this map yesterday at the museum. Many of you would have probably seen this map yesterday at the museum. To further the distinction between the types of camps, we usually like to show this map that highlights the different types of incarceration and internment facilities that are found across the country. And we do this to highlight that Camp Livingston was not the only camp of this type. There were Army camps spread across the country, with several being located in the South. For example, there was Camp Forrest in Tennessee, and unfortunately this map and the use of it cuts off that, but Camp Forrest was also an Army camp. So in World War II, Camp Livingston was a well-known Army installation. It was located about 12 miles north of Alexandria, Louisiana. It was built in 1940, and it was originally known as Camp Tioga, but was renamed to Livingston for the negotiator of the Louisiana Purchase. Camp Livingston is most probably well known as the site of the 1941 Louisiana Maneuvers, which was a 400,000-man training exercise which involved two imaginary countries fighting each other. So the Louisiana Maneuvers served as an exercise that would transform the United States Army into a modernized fighting force. Almost 500,000 men descended on this area of Louisiana and constituted the largest peacetime training maneuvers ever conducted by the US Army. The careers of Dwight Eisenhower, George Patton, and Omar Bradley, and others took off after successfully leading troops in these maneuvers. So the story of this camp that often goes untold is one of the Japanese civilian men deemed enemy aliens that were held there between 1942 to 1943.
To learn about Camp Livingston meant doing extensive research at the National Archives, which is colloquially known between librarians and historians and researchers as NARA. So if you hear us refer to it as NARA, we're talking about the National Archives. So we went to NARA without fully knowing at all what we were looking for. We were just trying to find documentary evidence that an internment camp existed at Camp Livingston. So this is a picture showing the location of the alien internment camp within the larger Camp Livingston area in Alexandria as well. So Camp Livingston had already been constructed. And then shortly after Pearl Harbor, it was decided that an alien internment section would be added. We know about the physical construction and layout of the camp through this thing we're going to be talking about called the Camp Completion Report, Volume 4. Volume 4 is very important. And it's dedicated solely to the construction of this alien internment camp. Construction of the camp and the hospital facilities totaled approximately $1.5 million. And on February 24th, 1942, a letter was sent to contractors stating, quote, "The Secretary of War finds that it is in the interest of the national defense that this work be not delayed, awaiting the negotiation of a formal contract." So this statement, this letter, shows that there were already men detained and waiting to be transferred into camps, to Army camps like Livingston. Here you can see an image of the building schedule for Camp Livingston's alien internment camp.
So one of the major documents that we were hoping to examine at the National Archives was the Camp Livingston Completion Report, Volume 4. But this was all that was in the box at the archives when we went to pull it, however. And you can see that there are only 3 volumes. Volume 4 was missing. So like good librarians, we decided to pull everything surrounding that box in the collection, just in case it had been misfiled. So we pulled the boxes before and after, where that was supposed to be, and we ended up finding Volume 4, proving that no system is perfect. But with a little ingenuity, you can find what seems to be missing.
So this volume contains a listing of all structures built within the camp, as well as photographs and schematics for the structures. Images like these are important to show as the physical structures that made up Camp Livingston no longer exist. There are also maps of the barracks as well as where the internment camp was located within Camp Livingston, which we saw like 2 slides ago. We like to highlight this volume. As we can all see, it is not particularly interesting to look at all. But I mean, the cover, the inside the pages, like it doesn't look like anything. But spread across hundreds of government documents like completion reports, memos, and rosters is what we've had to sift through and piece together in order to tell a cohesive story and history of Camp Livingston and try to bring this history of internment there to life. Following are some examples of pages within the camp completion report. If you are closely examining, you see a schematic drawing of the camp. Just an aside, we were not expecting the screen to be this large, so I don't know that you have to closely examine it. You can just... So this schematic is actually a drainage and topography layout of the internment camp. At second glance, however, you can actually get a sense of the layout of the barracks within the camp, which I will point to it. So like this, right? These are sections within the camp. Those are sections within the camp, and you can see the barrack buildings. This is just an example of how you can examine documents on multiple levels, not just at face value, because we might discover more meaning to them. So as we went over the report, we started to see actual photographs that were taken inside of the internment camp. Here we have a guard tower, a sentry post, a photo of a building, which is a mess hall. But then, turn to page, started to get very exciting. This is the first photograph that we had found, our first photographic documentation of the men held at Camp Livingston. I get chills just talking about it now. This photo shows unidentified Japanese men planting around a latrine building. But this was our first major find at NARA. This brought home what we were doing. These are people that we are looking into, trying to research. Until this point, we had never found any photographic evidence of the men interned at Camp Livingston. This is a modified version. Again, we didn't realize the screen was going to be so big, so this is great though. This is a modified version of the previous image. We've zoomed in on the men, and when we saw this photo, like I said earlier, it made this research so real to us, and it is what has kept us going throughout this entire process, because we knew that there would be more to find and piece together.
Speaking of more to find, here are some shots of the camp rosters that we found at the National Archives. The archives does not appear to have a complete roster set. List 4 seems to be missing because they have camp lists 1, 2, 3, and 5, and we have no idea of how many rosters were actually created. So while it was exciting to find the names of the men being held in Livingston, the rosters are when some of the most real and daunting work actually began. We went through each roster and searched for records of the men. We searched ancestry sites, ship manifest, tools like the Japanese Cultural Center of Hawaii's internee directory, and even Google searches for the men, and we turned up various website content from organizations, individuals, like blog posts, all kinds of stuff. So through examining these rosters, we've been able to put together a general picture of the camp makeup. So we have been able to isolate where the men were living when they were detained, their occupations, and their ages. Their ages ran the gamut from their 20s to their 80s, with the majority of the men being in their 50s. These men were religious figures, community leaders, teachers, and business owners. And just as an aside, we owe a debt of gratitude to Duncan Williams, who helped us dedupe and correct any mistakes in the transcribed roster list as part of his E-Ray project. So through using these rosters to locate families willing to share their artifacts and memories, as well as using the rosters to help us locate oral histories and diaries, we've been able to reposition these men and their experiences back into the forefront of this history. This podium is an example of a misattribution and misremembrance. This podium had been sitting in that Louisiana Maneuvers and Military Museum, and it had been attributed to a Japanese POW. It wasn't until we met with the museum curator that we were able to piece together that this podium was in fact made by internee, and we could prove that because his name was on our roster list. His name was Yonezo Suyasu, and he was the maker of the podium. He was born in Japan, and he was living in Hawaii with his family. After Camp Livingston, he was also held in Jerome and Tule Lake, and he was a carpenter. Being able to put the construction of this podium back into its rightful context via the rosters is one way that this type of research helps us to replace those dislocated artifacts or stories back into their appropriate context and make sure that the whole story of what happened in Camp Livingston, and most importantly, to the men, is told.
So as we've heard today and experienced on this pilgrimage, the idea of place to memory is essential. So with incarceration sites like Jerome and Rower, the memorialization of these experiences is a powerful marker to which pilgrims like y'all and us in attendance continue to return to keep this meaning alive and this memory alive. So this is Camp Livingston today. Nothing remains of the buildings that made up the internment camp. Nothing remains of the larger camp itself. This is why this type of research is so important. The men who experienced Camp Livingston are gone. The physical site is gone. The historical memory that should be present in Louisiana is missing. The work to uncover documents spread across archives around the country and piece those documents together in a meaningful way is intensive but incredibly rewarding work. We hope that our work on Camp Livingston will provide a representative example of what these types of Army internment camps were like, how they functioned, and how life was for the internees themselves.
So being able to bring these names to life for us via our research really helped to bring a sense of humanity back into our research and guided our mission in telling the story of Camp Livingston. So for us, we typically tell the story of Camp Livingston through the experiences of one extended family, as well as several individuals who we've been able to make contact with through our research. Having families share their stories and artifacts with us has been an honor, and bringing Camp Livingston to life via the men who experienced it and honoring those experiences has been at the forefront of our work.
So in closing, we would just like to thank you sincerely for this opportunity and take one extra second to again echo the importance of your story and sharing that story with not only your family, but with cultural memory institutions. It is essential to keeping these memories alive. And you never know, you may have two librarians call or email you or your descendants a couple years down the road looking to find out some more information. So the more that you can share these stories, you know, the more that this will not be forgotten and that this will not be relegated to a side note in history. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Well, good afternoon. So how many of you know about the 100th, 442nd and MIS? Oh, okay. Well, I guess I'm done. Maybe not. This is actually the medal that I had made up to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the campaign in Italy. Begins September 1943 to the end of the war, 1945. You know, what we got here, my talk primarily is going to be focusing on the Jerome Rohr camps, because when I talk about the Nisei soldiers from the camps, wherever camp or wherever the pilgrimage is at, I will focus on those soldiers. So the talk today will be focusing on these two particular areas, but I also talk about some of the Nisei civilians after the war that had a big impact on where we are today. So that's kind of where I'm coming from on this. You know, as I was growing up, because I'm sansei, it was really interesting growing up in Eastern Oregon because that was the first camp without a fence. Instead of the barbed wire and the machine guns and the barbed wire fences and the guards looking inward, our family decided to, you know, spend the war working at a labor camp. And that labor camp was outside of Nisei, Oregon. It was the first camp without a fence. Has anybody seen the display Uprooted a few years back? There's a website, and it's still up. And if you click on Uprooted, you'll come across the whole history of the first camp set up. That was the first camp, and then there were several others formed up afterwards. But our family was one of 350 that came out of the Portland Assembly Center and went to Eastern Oregon to help with the sugar beets. Yeah, also when I was growing up, you know, I didn't pay too much attention to Japanese because the language, but I always knew I was doing something bad when they spoke Japanese in front of us. How many sansei had that happen? Okay, yeah, been there, done that. Well, it's interesting because I heard the term shikataganai a lot, you know, from my parents. You know, it can't be helped. And then another term, and forgive my Japanese, because that was one of the other things that I learned not to do when I was growing up in the 50s and 60s, was speak Japanese, okay? It was not even 10 years after World War II, so it wasn't a very popular thing to speak Japanese at all. But the other term that I learned was, kodomo no tame ni, or tominai. It's like for the sake of the children. I heard that once in a while. In fact, I heard it quite a bit when they talked about sacrifices, and which is what the parents did. And it wasn't until I got a little bit older that another term that came up, and that was the Okage Sama De We, which is I am what I am because of you. And you know, we're all products of our past, and because of the sacrifices that our Nisei and Nisei made for us, is because we're all here today. So my whole role is to provide, I guess, a foothold for legacy for the Yonsei and the Gosei to take up that torch and to move. In fact, I had a wonderful conversation with some youngsters, some Yonsei, on the bus the other day, and you know what? I think there's hope. Believe it, there's hope. I mean, you got some people that just really want to carry on the torch. So I take my hat off to the younger generation that takes that task on. The interesting thing about the Nisei is that, you know, in November 1941, there were actually some Nisei being trained at the Presidio at Christie Field in San Francisco. Okay, about 60. I just round up a bit, but that was 1 month before Pearl Harbor got bombed. And then when Pearl Harbor got bombed, that 1-year training program turned into 6 months. So in May 1942, about 50 Nisei MIS went into the Pacific. Okay, yeah, they were the first ones. Another group of soldiers from the Hawaii National Guard, they were on their way to the mainland. And when they made landfall in Oakland, there were, I think, 1,432 to be exact that made it across the Pacific. When they reached Oakland, they were redesignated as the 100th Infantry Battalion separate, because at that point in time, no one wanted them. Okay, so then they boarded 3 trains and they went 3 separate directions, and the final destination, at least for now, was Camp McCoy. Now, Camp McCoy is not in the South. Okay, go, this is about south. Well, it's interesting because at Camp McCoy, when they arrived, there were some units at Camp McCoy, primarily the 2nd Infantry Division, called the Indian Head Division. Okay, and they had a lot of Texans in there. And in our first panel this morning, we had a young lady with the Cherokee tribe. Well, in Oklahoma and Texas, there were actually Native Americans in the 2nd Infantry Division, and there were also Mexican Americans. So when the Nisei soldiers showed up at Camp McCoy, you know, they loved the townspeople. They loved they loved Wisconsin. They were treated very well. Okay, and then but the camp itself, that's when they ran into these Indian Head soldiers. And I don't know what it is about Texas. How many people do we have from Texas? Okay, well, I still outnumber you. But those Texans took offense by seeing Japanese American soldiers in American uniforms. Why is the enemy wearing an American uniform? They called them yellow bellies, and they called them that J word. And you know what? You never, ever call an AJA that J word, because that started the fights. And in the book, Unlikely Liberators, Masayo Umezawa Dews has a little song. It's called 1 Little 2 Little 3 Little Indians, 4 Little 5 Little 6 Little Indians, 7 Little 8. That song goes up to 38. That's how many Texans of the 2nd Infantry Division were put in the hospital with broken arms, broken legs, and other contusions compared to 1 Nisei. What the Texans didn't know was that the soldiers from the Hawaii National Guard, now designated 100th Infantry Battalion separate, were judo and karate experts. And these guys were, you know how tall Texans are. You know, the taller you are, the harder you fall. But education is a slow process, okay? But I think they learned the lessons. Well, what about the Native Americans? Well, you know what? Some of them even joined the Nisei. And the Mexican Americans, some of them did too. Because see, I mean, there was no shortage of discrimination during World War II at these training camps, okay? So they actually, some of them joined the Nisei soldiers to pay some debts, okay? Which is pretty cool. Actually, not that I advocate violence, but while they were there, about 26 soldiers from the 100th Infantry Battalion were told they were going on a secret mission. You know, they couldn't even talk about it. You know, they were going on a secret mission. Ooh, well, you know, well, I'm going to go, and we're going to get our ration of beer too. So anyhow, they find themselves going down to Cat Island Gulf of Mississippi, right off the coast of Mississippi, Alabama. And their secret mission is to be bait, because someone convinced Roosevelt that dogs can be trained to attack Japanese soldiers in the Pacific. Well, since we didn't have that many Japanese prisoners at that time, we did have some Japanese people, and they were the 100th Battalion. So these people soldiers got volunteered to be the bait. And their job was to hide out in the the so-called jungle of Cat Island, which mimics some of the topography of the Pacific Islands. And they were supposed to lie in wait. And when the dogs came, they were supposed to, fire a blank or something and lay on their back and put a slab of meat on their throat. And of course, the dogs, they took the meat and then they licked the Nisei soldiers. Someone didn't get the memo that, maybe, thinking that these dogs are smart enough, they could find, they know who a Japanese national is compared to a Japanese American, but they didn't. In fact, it has more to do with diet. Okay. But even then, they did a couple tests and it was a failure. But so just before being shipped back to, actually, they were going to go back to Camp Shelby because they were there for so long. In the meantime, the 100th Infantry Battalion moved from Camp McCoy to Camp Shelby. So they meet up with their counterparts in Camp Shelby, but not before they consumed 3 months of beer in 3 weeks. So when they get back to Camp Shelby, the soldiers of the 100th B Company 3rd Platoon, they have beer bellies. And if they were on a secret mission, then I want to be on that secret mission too. But they had to drink that allotment or it would go to waste. But that's why they came back with beer bellies. So there's a comical little anecdote to these stories. The thing about Camp Shelby, when the 142nd was there, was that, Hattiesburg was not a very hospitable place. Okay, even the soldiers who were there in training, they still took a lot of abuse from the soldiers. In this case, it was the 85th Infantry Division, and the fights started, and they just never could get warmed up to Hattiesburg because no one really liked the Nisei. They tried to have social events, and that wasn't going to happen because the women of Hattiesburg didn't want to have anything to do with the Nisei. So, the thing is that there was a gentleman by the name of Earl Finch. He had a little store in Hattiesburg, and he really liked the Japanese Americans because they really took care of his invalid mother. Respect your elders. That's exactly what they did. And he was touched by that. So when he found out that couldn't get any women from Hattiesburg to dance with the Nisei soldiers, out of his own pocket, he transported women from Jerome and Roar to go up to Camp Shelby. That's another part of the story that's pretty cool. But Earl Finch was a gem. He loved the Nisei loved him. After the war, he actually moved to Hawaii, and that's where he died. So Earl Finch is in the hearts of a lot of people. The bottom line with Camp Shelby experience with 142nd is that, they didn't like the values, the way things were being done in Mississippi, treating the African Americans and other minorities. And they thought, what, we can't change it. They were ordered not to get any more fights. And so they resolved that if they were going to do any fighting, it was going to be for the America represented by Wisconsin, and believe it or not, I think Minnesota should be added to this list too, because when the Nisei soldiers of MIS were in Minnesota, Minnesotans treated them very well too. So they wanted to be, remember that Wisconsin, Minnesota treated them well, not represent the values of the Mississippi because of the bad treatment that they got. They wanted America that treated everybody the same. Okay. So anyhow, that was the Cat Island experiment. And the thing about the Cat Island, there's a program called Dogs for Defense. And that's a program where Americans were invited to donate their pets to the Army. They had about 400 dogs and pets that they donated. And Lord knows what happened to some of these animals, because some of the reports that I got from the men who were part of that secret mission, they were told to do things to the dogs that they would never, ever do, ever. So I won't go into that because my wife's probably listening in. Well, this is the breakdown. I guess the 3D element doesn't work too well, but I zeroed in on the rower and the jerome. These are the men who served from this camp, about 1,096, okay, which is pretty good sized number. Now, when the 442nd got organized, about 3/4 were from the Hawaiian Islands and about 1/4 from the mainland. And the military really thought that they were going to get a lot of men, volunteers from the camps. Well, that didn't happen. I wonder why. If you're put in a camp and told to volunteer, probably not very many would come forward. But there were about 10,000 Hawaiians that wanted to join the fight. But they can only take about 3,000, less than 3,000. So that's what made up the 142nd, actually the 442nd, because the 100th, they were already sent to North Africa at that time. That was like, I think, August 1943, okay? So you got the MIS, they went to the Pacific, May 1942. You got the 100th, they went to North Africa in August 1943. So the first Nisei who were in the fight of things were the MIS, okay? They're the ones that set the standard on if a Nisei, Japanese American, could be trusted, okay? And that's, in my mind, that's why they sent the 100th to North Africa first, okay? But anyhow, you've heard about the fights that the 442nd got in with the mainlanders from the mainland United States. Haven't heard that story? Okay, I won't tell it then. What happened? I'm sorry, Aaron. What happened was that because they didn't know that most of these soldiers came from the camps. Okay, top money that you can earn from camp if you worked was, I think, $12 to $19 a month. So if you put in 40, 50, 60 hours a week, you're still going to get $12 to $16. Who would work in that situation? So any money that the soldiers earn, mainland soldiers earn, they send it back to their family at the camp. So anytime the Hawaiians would go to a bar, they would expect the mainlander to pay the bill, but they couldn't. And they thought the mainlanders were cheap. So that's when the fight started, okay? And the story goes that when a mainlander's head hit the floor, it sounded like a coconut. And that's how they got the name Kotonk. Kotonk. And of course, with the mainlanders, because they were slick talking, they could slip in Buddha for pig head instead of Buddha head. So you had to listen carefully, and depending on the insult from a mainlander, if they call you a Buddha head, then you probably get in a fight. But that's where the Buddha head for the Hawaiians and the Katonks from the mainlanders came. Okay, now you heard the story. You can say that you heard it from me. So I got to get going here, huh? So anyhow, this is the makeup of the Pacific, about 64 million square miles. It's about 28%, not about, exactly 28% of the whole surface area of the Earth is the Pacific Ocean. So you had about 6,000 MIS, Japanese Americans, attached, assigned in small groups to every combat unit in the Pacific, and also our allies, okay, which is the British, the New Zealanders, the Chinese, Indians, Canadians. They were all attached. But the Canadians, because they locked up their Canadian, British Columbia, Japanese Americans there, they didn't have any Nisei, so they bought them from the United States until Canada was able to get Nisei trained under orders from Churchill. Churchill had to intervene and tell British Columbia to get with the program. And this is just a quick graphic of the defense commands. The command, MacArthur and let's see, yeah, under MacArthur period, because he couldn't have a second. They used he had the most extensive use of Nisei, and they had a group of Allied translator interpreter service near just outside of Brisbane, Australia, and they did everything. They deciphered, interrogated, garnered all kinds of information about the Japanese army. In fact, MacArthur knew more about what the Japanese were going to do than the Japanese did. And that's why they had the lowest casualty rate in the Pacific. They used the Nisei most extensively. All the other commands did too, but not as extensively as MacArthur. Even Eisenhower had a small detachment in his Supreme Allied headquarters when they got to Paris. And this is when the 100th, when they finally were joined up to the 34th Infantry Division. I have to make note here that no matter where the Nisei were at, whether it was in the Pacific or in Europe, they weren't wanted. Nobody wanted them, okay? So they had an uphill battle, especially the Nisei in the Pacific, because they wanted to get into the action, and they were relegated to menial tasks. So finally, some officers took some initiative and found out how valuable the Nisei MIS were because it saved lives. So when the demand for MIS started to increase, they had to move from Camp Savage to Fort Snelling. So by the time the end of the war, there were about 6,000 Japanese Americans in the Pacific. Okay, but here in Italy, you see the shield of the 100th Infantry Battalion, the first four from 929. That was September 29th, 43 was their first battle. And as they go up the boot of Italy, around June 4th, that's when the breakout Vanzio and almost into Rome. Rome fell on June 5, okay? The 442nd, they weren't there yet. They were there, but they weren't joined up with the 100th. The story goes that the 100th thought that the 442nd would be blended into their unit, but because the 100th was the battalion, the 442nd was essentially a regiment short one battalion. So when they left America, they left their first battalion back at Camp Shelby to train more soldiers. But the replacements came from the 442nd into the 100th. So even though you trained as a 442nd soldier, when you were attached to the 100th, you were their property. You were 100th. Some of the 442nd guys resented that, but after a while, they realized that they had a pretty good deal. The 100th was a pretty good combat unit. So first day of combat for the Nisei of the 442 was June 26th. And then as you go up, you'll see September 6, 1942, and there's a difference, April 5, 1945. That's when the Nisei went to France. And of course, how many know what happened in France? No, they didn't go see the Eiffel Tower. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to keep you guys awake because usually I have explosions and I have machine guns going, maybe some grenades, going off in the background, just keep people awake. But when it was all said and done, the 100th became the 1st Battalion, and they kept that designation even to this very day. So in June 1944, the 100th was not the 1st Battalion of the 442nd. It was the 100th Battalion of the 442nd. So like I say, because of their battle honors, they became known as the Purple Heart Battalion, okay? When they made landfall from North Africa at Salerno, they had 1,300 men. When they reached the Abiman Casino, they had 521. So where are the replacements going to come from? It came from the 442. This is what happened in France. What's really interesting to hear is that in France, the Vosges Mountains were practically impregnable. It was tough going. Ooh, my graphics. Anyhow, the graphics that I have, it shows the path that all the units took. The fighting around Bruyères was especially bitter. It took about 4.5, 5 days to take Bruyères because they had to take the surrounding hills, okay? Casualties were really high. And they were in combat for another 7, 8 days, and they were promised by their commanding general, Dahlquist, that they would get rest and relief. But in the meantime, a battalion of the 141st Regiment got surrounded. In fact, they were purposely led into a trap. So it was up to the 2nd, 3rd Battalion, 2nd and 3rd Battalion, actually all 3 battalions, because this is one of the rare cases where all 3 battalions were engaged in the same battle at the same time. Usually you have 1 battalion that's in reserve, okay? But in this situation, all 3 battalions were committed. But the 100th and the 3rd Battalion were responsible for making the relief, okay? Not the rescue, but it's called a relief. But I had these graphics where it would show, but the green arrowhead there, that's the Texas battalion that got surrounded. So after getting them all rescued and whatnot, I think the 3rd week of November, they were rendered combat ineffective, which meant they weren't a combat unit anymore. But reserves were already on the way. In fact, they were already there. So they were moved down southern France and moved toward the Italian-French border for guard duty and some combat. But the combat that they had along the Italian-French border was nothing compared to what they were going to get into when they went back to Italy. But the combat in the Vosges Mountains was especially bitter. It was really bad. And these are the Medal of Honor recipients who were upgraded. What's really interesting is that during the war, only 1 Medal of Honor was awarded. And that took the prodding of Mike Masaoka and a senator from Utah to get the military to look at their records again to finally honor Sadao Munamori, his Medal of Honor, almost a year after he gave up his life. And that was during the Gothic Line battle on April 5, 1945. But in the order that I have here, these were the DSCs, Distinguished Service Crosses, and Silver Stars that were awarded. The first 5 DSCs went to the 100th because they were there first, okay? So all in all, when you look at the records here, let's see, Tenoi, and you got Nishimoto. They were the ones from Jerome and Rohr from this camp, got their Medal of Honor. And they're recognized at the memorial. And in fact, there's a couple other names on that memorial that are also shared at Amache. So like Calvin and George Seidel, they also show up at the memorial at Amache. But these were the 21, 16 Medals of Honor were awarded for Italy, only 5 in France. So that's why I spend more time in Italy than in France. Of these people, there were 12 were Buddhist. Okay. And these are the ones that came from the camps. Of course, I've got Ted Tenoi and Joe Nishimoto. And Sadao Munamori came from Manzanar. And I borrowed this from our stamp program, courtesy of the U.S. Postal Service. Shows the campaign. If you have that stamp book, I think they still have them for sale. And here's the memorial. And that's Whitey Yamamoto. I actually met him a few years ago before he passed away, and a very humble person. He was in the anti-tank company that got detached from the 442nd, and they were part of the Operation Dragoon, August 15th, 1944. But they caught up to the 442nd just as they were going into the Lost Battalion. So they had litter duty when they got back. What's really interesting about this legacy is that it's something that we all need to, young folks need to carry on because of the extreme sacrifices that the Issei and the Nisei made. The sansei, you know, a lot of my counterparts were like, well, why didn't you guys do something? The Nisei, they're talking to their parents. Why did you do something? Well, they became the lawyers, you know, the driving force to right a wrong. And what's interesting when I'm looking at the demographics of all the Nisei and the sansei from the various camps, they meet the demographics of professions, just like any other group. And what's really interesting is that there's a couple of names that I want to at least make special mention. And of course, we have George Takei, our actor and activist. We got Roy Matsumoto. He was with Merrill's Marauders. He was inducted into Rangers Hall of Fame. But the one lady that I really admire, she's passed away, was Aiko Herzig Yoshinaga. Do we have any relatives of hers here at all? Well, you know what? She was a researcher, and she was doing some research for the Commission on the War Relocation and Internment of Civilians in 1980. And she was the one that found the smoking gun on the report that the War Department, not the War Department, but I guess it was the civilian group that wrote this particular document called the, let's see what it's called. Got it here somewhere. It was the final report for the Japanese evacuation. And they had two reports. The one was sent without being reviewed by John McCloy. Okay, he was Assistant Secretary of War. He wanted to review the report before Carl Benson sent it from DeWitt's headquarters. And in that report, that's where the smoking gun was, because John McCloy saw several references that never should have been in that report. So he ordered Benson to get all the copies, and there were 10, to get them, burn them, destroy them, get them off the planet, destroy all the evidence, get rid of the transmittal letters, the transmitted the report, and then reissue another report that he had made the comments and put a new cover letter to it. Well, guess what? She found the 10th copy that was not destroyed. And when Peter Irons got his hands on that document, it was like, oh my goodness, we got him. The government lawyers lied to the Supreme Court. Okay, so that set the stage for the redress. But she is really pivotal in this program. But I just wanted to let you people know that even she started out at Manzanar, she came from Jerome Rohr camp. So, you know, just something that I think you all need to know, that without her looking at that report and knowing that it was big, because she saw the original or the second copy and it didn't look even the same, she knew that this one was the one that got supposed to be destroyed. And I have to thank heavens for that NARA archivist, because for that person to leave it on the desk, for her to find it, I'm thinking that bureaucrat did their job. Okay, you don't suppress evidence. And that's exactly what an archivist does not want to do, right? No. Well, and that's kind of covered my presentation. I think I went over a little bit, but anyhow, you know, this presentation is dedicated to all people who serve women. We're in the Women Army Corps, Nurse Corps, And there were soldiers, doctors who were in other units. You know, one thinks that all the Japanese Americans were in one unit called the 142nd or MIS. Well, you know what? As long as I've been doing this research, there are Nisei who were in ones and twos, all divisions of the United States Army, even making the landing in Normandy. They parachuted into Normandy with the 82nd, 101st. We had parachutists in the Philippines. So, like I say, you know, the Congressional Gold Medal goes to any person and family who served. So that's what I want to say. But I want to thank you for your attention. Thanks for your patience and trying to laugh along with my poor jokes. But anyhow, thank you.
Thank you so much. So we have some time for questions, and Kimiko and I will bring a mic to you if you have a question. While you're thinking about that, I want to say two quick things. The first is that the MacArthur Museum, that I do not remember the full title, Arkansas Military History Museum, which is close by here, has an exhibit up right now actually about the 100th 442. They're open tomorrow from 10 to 5. If you're interested in checking that out, we can send out some more information in Kimiko's daily email later today. And the second is that if you're interested, at Camp Shelby, which is in Mississippi, there's the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum, and they have a pretty extensive part of their museum that's dedicated to the 100th 442 that trained there. So it's a place to visit if you're back in the South in Hattiesburg. They've also just begun an archaeological dig at the site where the 442 was based during World War II. And so if that's something you're interested in, I can send you some information if you come chat with me or connect you with the archaeologists who are working on that. I think they're interested in perhaps having some community connection. And so that's something I just want to flag for folks that's beginning now if you're interested in that, and at least to visit the museum. It's fantastic. So thank you so much. This was so exciting to hear about. I'm sure there are questions out there. So, all right, great. Kimiko, your side over there. We will bring the microphone to you.
Hello, hello. This question is for the gentleman. You had the pictures of the 442nd Medal of Honor people, and off to the right was Daniel Inouye. And his name is always mentioned when we talk about the 442nd. He was not a Medal of Honor?
Yes, he was. He was the last one.
Okay. And then he was, you know, in charge. He was a judge for the Watergate hearings, and he's probably the one most important that everybody knows, right?
Oh, yeah. And the Watergate. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, yes. We want to have Hayley and Sarah. There we go. Yeah. Anyone else have a question? Oh.
Oh, thank you. Hello, Hayley and Sarah. This is Norm Ishimoto in the back. Hiya. I wanted to make a couple of announcements, sort of. My dad told me in a 1990 oral history that he did a trip to New Orleans, and he was with an administrator of the WRA. I don't know which camp it was, either Jerome, could have been Rohr. He was in, it would have been in late 43, early 44, where he was to have, he went down to set up a recruitment office to place Nisei, to place them in the seafood industry, probably. They found an office, rented furniture, and for some reason the project never worked out. Of course, he was just going to be the employee, but most of the Nisei and many of the sansei in this room could have grown up in New Orleans, speaking in drawls. myself and my sister included. My sister Mary Morris is in the room someplace. But the project never got authorized to continue. But this is a bit of knowledge that we might all, or many of us, could have done this. And you know, one of the many bits of tidbits of information that may never have gotten known had my dad never told me, and now I'm telling everybody in the room. Now, before the session started, Kimiko made the announcement that as part of a little project that I'm doing on behalf of, well, in favor of Rosalie Gould, who was unable to be here because she's in her elderly years. You know, everybody knows what she has done for the memory of our people in, I'm sorry, my brain is scrambling, in Aurora and in the cemetery, in the monuments, and in Jerome. I bought a bunch of greeting cards, and I was lucky enough to start passing them around and having everybody who's in the distinguished panels and some of the participants. I'm asking everybody here to autograph them, and those of us who are artists, to just spend a couple of minutes to embroider the borders of the cards. But basically, I want, by the time this is over, for everybody to just autograph the cards and then bring them back to me at the end of it so that I can send them to Rosalie, care of her daughter. Well, actually, I have her address. And then as a way of saying thank you for all that she's done for us. So I will, as I can do it, I have about 7 or 8 cards. Some of them have already been started. Some of them are empty still. Please just sign your name in the middle or on the back if they get filled up. Again, if you're an artist, kind of embroider your designs around the edges. And that's all I've got to say at the moment. Thank you very much, everybody.
I have a question down here.
Hi, Mr. Hirai. Question, you mentioned that very important point about not all JAs were in the 442nd 100th. So can you explain the circumstances under which some of these people were separate, kept separate, the Japanese Americans?
Yeah, I'm having a hard time hearing the question.
Oh, that was a question about Japanese Americans who were not in the 100th or 442. Can you talk a little bit about the circumstances that would have had them in other units or the MIS?
Well, what's really interesting about that question is that there were commanders in the U.S. Army that gave their soldiers an option. If they wanted to go with the 142nd, they could. And if they wanted to stay in their unit, they could. There were even commanding officers that told their Nisei, don't join the 442, stay with me. So that's the kind of option that there was, mainly because you had officers that disobeyed orders out of conscience. So that's why and besides, when you look at the doctors that were around at the time, you couldn't get all the doctors in the 142nd. There were so many of them. So they were shipped out to other units. Okay?
Hey, we have one here. I have a question about the Japanese soldiers. Over the years, I've heard some hearsay, and I was wondering if these facts are true. One is that the Japanese soldiers liberated Dachau, and also that they were the first ones to liberate Paris, but they were taken out of the photo archives that were part of the social media of the time.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a multifaceted question. The thing about the only unit that was in that area was the 522nd, the Field Artillery Battalion. They were detached from the 442 in March 1945. But it wasn't Dachau. It was a sub-camp, satellite of Dachau. that was liberated. Now, as far as what soldiers not going into Paris for leave or something, well, if the commanding officers allowed all of the soldiers to go to Paris, there wouldn't be anybody fighting because they all wanted to go to Paris.
No,
Yeah,
Stu, I think that the question was about the liberation of Paris and whether or not the Nisei soldiers were kind of tried to be removed from the history of that.
Well, it's an interesting question too, is that the Japanese Americans, even though the replacements came from the Channel side, traveled south, they weren't part of the Normandy invasion. If anything, they were part of the invasion of southern France. And the invasion of southern France on August 15, 1944, was one of those invasions that doesn't get any attention. But if you go to southern France and visit the towns and cities that were liberated by the 142nd and even the anti-tank company, there's celebrations. There's celebrations even to this day. So yeah, I mean, it would have been, I think it would have been, you know, probably technically incorrect to have any unit be part of the liberation of Paris because they just weren't there. But Japanese Americans who were there in single units, they were probably there, but not the entire unit because they did not participate in Overlord.
Yeah, just to elaborate on the other services, I think the Air Force had a number of Japanese Americans who were flying in the airplanes as bombardiers or navigators. And they were never taken out of their role in the Air Force. So they continued. So there were others that served in the Air Force or the Army Air Force at that time that were not in the 442 or the 100.
Yeah, they just couldn't be pilots. When the Army made their directives, they couldn't be pilots. They couldn't be in the Chemical Corps. There were a lot of units that they could not be in, but the ones they could be in was infantry. Okay. But there are, yeah, I know there's quite a few reports where we had tail gunners, waist gunners that were in the bombers. So, you know, in fact, there were Nisei and probably in the other in the Navy, Merchant Marine, Coast Guard. But they were in small numbers. It doesn't get advertised. But there were Nisei practically everywhere. It just wasn't in a large number where it would attract attention.
Okay, we have one, probably the last question. Oh, right here.
I had a question in regards to the Camp Livingston. I thought you said you had like a partial list of people that were there. Or complete, I wasn't sure. I know my grandfather was there, and I wasn't sure, you know, but don't know much more about that other than at the end he was sent to the camp, discharged to the camp where his wife was, where he was put in the hospital there and died. So I didn't know anything about how they were treated, so on. I didn't know what things, other things that you have, just, you know, how many people were there, what information, more information, because it sounded like you're still in the process of gathering, and if you have like a website or someplace where you can look some of the details that you did find.
We'll share this one. Let's do a switcheroo. Thank you for that. So there were approximately 1,171 men that we've been able to identify. Their treatment was under the Geneva Convention, so the Geneva Convention of 1929. So there were quite a few rules that surrounding their treatment that the men that were in camp were very aware of. It seems like they were very aware of what they could do, what they should not be doing. There were, what else can we say about this? We could talk for hours.
Yeah, we do have a lot more information. We know about their daily life in camp, the labor that they did in camp, activities that they did, such as educational, artistic, sports activities. But we don't have a website right now. We have a book that's coming out later this year, and we can share that information with Kamiko when we have a date as to when it's going to be released, if you're interested in that. But you can always contact us directly, because there was so much more about daily life that we couldn't fit into the 15 minutes. But we have all of that kind of information that we've been able to reconstruct from those government documents, from those diaries. So we've got a pretty good idea of what life was like inside a camp.
Thank you so much. Maybe one more round of applause for our panelists. Thank you. And Hayley, Sarah, and Stu are all here for the pilgrimage. So any other questions, find them at dinner, find them tomorrow, find them tonight. Show up at the rooms. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you, guys.